So Pact 17 is about animal behaviour, even in the most simplest animals. So behaviour really is this ability to detect and respond to changes in the environment. Even the simplest things, such as a bacteria like E. coli, has developed this ability to respond to, for example, concentrations of particular chemicals. The chemical we're talking about will be the food, and E. coli actually move towards food because they detect the concentration increasing. This is obviously really useful survival advantage because it means that E. coli get food when it's necessary, and if the E. coli that exhibits that behaviour will survive longer, will reproduce more, and over many generations a higher proportion of that behaviour will be passed on, and there we have evolution. Similarly, in invertebrates, which are animals without backbones, and that includes all insects and things like worms, woodlice exhibit the simple behaviour of remaining in shaded areas. That obviously is something of an advantage to the woodlice because they're less visible to their predators, so again it means they will survive longer and they will pass on that behaviour just the same as they passed on the characteristics that we saw in the earlier packs. Another invertebrate example is the earthworm, who tend to contract if they are touched, so such as the beak of a bird, for example, and the rapid contraction actually pulls the worm back underground, and again this will help it survive its predators. The fly, another invertebrate, has developed an incredible compound eye which enables it to respond extremely fast to any movement nearby, and again it prevents it being killed by its predators. Now on page 5 of the pack we have to consider how we actually study these behaviours, because how do we know that woodlice tend to stay in the shade? I mean, I guess our experience of woodlice suggests that they like to remain in the shade, but we have to bear in mind that we're doing science and we need ways of being sure that that is their behaviour. Now we can study woodlice quite nicely using a thing called a choice chamber. Now this is what a choice chamber really looks like. It's got sort of two levels, but over the base there's going to be a layer of muslin stretched across it that the actual woodlice can crawl across. So we create 4 different chambers in this choice chamber. On half of the chamber, as you'll see on page 5, we cover it with dark card so it's quite dark, and then on a different 2/4 of the choice chamber we can put damp cotton wool to make 2 of the quarters nice and moist. On the other 2/4 we'll make them dry. We can use something like calcium carbonate to make those quarters dry, and then finally we get this sheet and we put the lid over it, and it stretches it really quite nice and taut so that the woodlice can move around on top. And you'll see there's a hole in the middle there that they can get inside. The experiment really just involves waiting for a while and then counting which quarter of our choice chamber the woodlice end up in, And of course it's quite a simple, nice experiment, and repeated many times we end up with the woodlice going in the nice damp and shaded or dark area. It's a good demonstration of the behaviours of the woodlice, and we can make a sensible guess that the woodlice benefit from being in a damp area. They're very small animals, they've got a large surface area compared to their size, so they could easily dry out if they're in a very dry area. Likewise, they prefer the dark area because it hides them from their predators. Now on page 6 of our pack, we just need to do a little bit of research and learn a bit about some newborn reflexes. And they're reflexes which will usually disappear over time, but they're very useful to a baby for its survival, to keep it alive early on. It's a quite interesting theory about sudden infant death syndrome, that it's to do with a newborn reflex that hasn't gone away. Inside the womb, the reflex to low oxygen levels will probably be for the fetus to actually move around less, so it doesn't need as much oxygen for respiration, but this response would normally disappear in a newborn after a while. But some people have suggested that maybe this newborn response to move around less could be the cause of sudden infant death syndrome, because maybe if the levels of oxygen had gone down because the bed covers were covering the airways, the baby, instead of moving and being able to catch more air, it actually moved less and perhaps led to suffocation. And it's a theory. It's a very hard thing to actually demonstrate for sure. Now in this pack we go over the idea of the nervous pathway, which we've seen before, where we start with a stimulus that is detected by a receptor. The receptors actually may be a collection of cells within a large organ. The sensory neurons will then carry the signal from the receptor cells to a processing centre, which in the nervous system would normally be in the central nervous system. The motor neuron then carries the signal from the processing centre to the effector. Remember, the effector can be a gland, or at least some cells within a gland that secrete a hormone, or a muscle, which will eventually lead to a response. Now the outcome in to do with receptors and effectors suggests that they can be part of a complex organs. For example, in an eye, where light enters the eye and it is picked up by a collection of light receptor cells in the retina of the eye, and a signal is then carried from the optic nerve to the visual part of the brain, right at the back of the brain, and from that visual cortex a signal can be sent to many other parts of the brain. Maybe it's to the area that helps us understand reading, or it may be to other motor parts of the brain which will send signals to muscles and help us respond to a visual stimulus. Of course, this action by nerves is very fast, and the response that it elicits will typically be quite a short response, and it will probably be a response in quite a small specific area of your body. Now this is in contrast of course to a hormonal response, which is the very opposite. We've got a relatively slow response, although it's still actually quite fast. If you think about the response of adrenaline when we see something quite frightening, our heart can start pumping very quickly, and other effects of something like adrenaline, which is released from adrenal glands that sort of sit just on top of the kidneys, causes a range of responses for a relatively long time, well, compared to that of a nervous response at least, and the area of responses can be all round the body in many different places, again in contrast to a nervous response, which is probably going to be in quite a specific group of muscles or a particular gland. Now, two examples of hormones that are mentioned in this part of the spec are insulin and estrogen. And insulin, which is released from the pancreas, which is just sort of below the stomach, contains a group of cells which actually detect changes in blood glucose level, and those cells release insulin when a high level of blood glucose is detected, and this leads levels of glucose to be reduced because it causes the liver particularly to take in glucose and convert it to a carbohydrate molecule which is a bit like starch and is called glycogen, and that is stored in muscles and in liver for later when it's needed. On the other hand, another group of cells in the pancreas will release glucagon hormone if the blood glucose levels are low, and this does the opposite of insulin, and it causes that glycogen molecule, a big long carbohydrate, to be broken down and release glucose back into the blood to restore the levels of blood glucose to normal. Now the other example hormone it mentions is estrogen, and that's released from ovaries in females, and it's got a lot of different effects actually, but probably the most important role is in the regulation of the menstrual cycle. And again, we just reiterate that the response of hormones is longer lasting and has an effect in not just one little place but possibly in many parts of the body. And the final outcome of the pack is just this idea that the development of these really complicated nervous and hormonal systems in large multicellular organisms came about through a very, very long process of evolution, and all these behaviours evolved because they offered survival advantages to the particular organisms